Welcome back. For those of you who are following us on live stream direct from the Top of the Hill Conference Center at the Reserve Officers Association, we're back, we're live. It's like Arnold, I'm back. I think people have pretty much made their way through the lunch line. Some of the food will be brought in to the room. If you have hunger pangs during the rest of the day, you can look there before we get to our reception with the yummy hors d'oeuvres and the drinks and so on. I don't even know how to begin to introduce our luncheon plenary speaker, activist, amazing writer. She's been called a poet with a knife. But one of the things that led me to include Sandra Steingraber in my book about Rachel Carson and the women who preceded Rachel and those who carry on directly inspired by and in her tradition was the combination of that sense of wonder we've been talking about. Sandra was actually a poet. Is that right? Yeah. Pretty good poet. Then she got her PhD in biology. And so like Rachel Carson, as you know, started out as an English major and a writer at the Pennsylvania College for Women, now Chatham, and fell under the spell, the influence of a woman professor who convinced her that science was something that she should do. And she continuously combined those. Sandra has done the same thing. She also shares with Rachel Carson, Sandra is a cancer survivor with a rare form, an early bladder cancer. During college, she knows the story better than I, but what struck me, that fabulous, inspiring speech when we talked about ACT UP and AIDS, cancer originally was treated the same way. Sandra came back to her room from having gone to see an oncologist or something, and her roommate had moved out. The bed was empty because she had cancer. And it was one of those things that was scary. And so whereas Rachel kept her cancer and only shared with her most intimate friends, Sandra has been able to talk about it directly, and so her first book, Living Downstream, which to me is one of the great classics of environmental health literature, combines that sense of wonder, the ability to paint pictures while describing and searching for what might have led to the environmental exposures that lead to cancer in central Illinois, where she grew up. And she has continued and carried that on through two other fabulous books. I do speak on campuses, and I always say to those of you who are women of childbearing age, and everyone sort of looks around, the guys get all confused, and I tell them about having faith, which remains a wonderful guide to pregnancy, among other things. But Sandra imagines, as she was pregnant with her daughter Faith, now much bigger, that it is a whole ecosystem. And there really is no distinction between what is in her womb and the outside world. And this is one of the key insights of Rachel Carson, that there is no distinction, that it flows through us to the Inuit mothers, to the people who live in North Carolina near the CAFOs, that there really is only a linguistic distinction between us humans and what's inside our bodies and what's outside. And so Sandra has done that with amazing, amazing power. Her last book, Raising Elijah, I will simply say, even I am not old enough to remember Elijah Lovejoy. Who died defending his press against mobs in abolition times, a true, incredibly brave martyr who actually worried that he shouldn't be doing this because he had kids, he had a family. Should I stand up to these brutes? and her son is named after Elijah Lovejoy. And so you have someone who then has taken, like Rachel Carson, this incredible writing, environmental health, the lack of distinctions between our bodies and the outside world, and then moved directly into the world of advocacy, of action, of politics, and of resistance. So that Sandra has formed an organization in upstate New York. She is a distinguished professor at Ithaca College. But as you know, I hope she has led with other people, but pretty much in the leadership of fighting fracking in that gorgeous piece of real estate known as upstate New York, has been arrested many times. And so she combines feeling, wonder, science, and activism in a way that I think we are all going to have to draw on in the days to come. And so it is my real honor to bring Sandra Steingraber up here, and I just can't wait to hear what she has to say. Sandra Steingraber.
Well, that was an amazing introduction. Thank you so much, Bob. It's an honor to be here, and yes, Rachel Carson is my guiding spirit in everything I do as a biologist, as a writer, as a woman, as a mother in these times. And I want to begin and end today by introducing a couple special people in the audience. And one is Kalyani Lee. So Kalyani, stand up right here and let the camera pan on you. So this is my fellow traveler in these vineyards that Rachel Carson planted for us, right? Kalyani is an actor who does the Rachel Carson monologues and has done them all over the world, and is here right from Bangladesh, where she represented the words and brought Rachel to life. And I'm really honored that you're in the audience, so thank you. So let's talk about the election. For many years, public-spirited citizens throughout the country have been working for conservation of natural resources, realizing their vital importance to the nation. Apparently, though, their hard-won progress is to be wiped out, as a politically minded administration returns us to the dark ages of unrestrained exploitation and destruction. It's one of the ironies of our time that while concentrating on the defense of our country against enemies from without, we should be so heedless of those who would destroy it from within. Those are not my words. Those are Rachel Carson's words. And they appeared in a letter to the editor of the Washington Post shortly after the 1952 presidential election. General Dwight Eisenhower, a man with little political experience, had just won the White House. Republicans now held majorities in both houses of Congress, and Joseph McCarthy held ruthless sway in the Senate. The trigger for Carson's letter, which is published at the beginning of the Eisenhower administration, was the firing and replacement of a longtime public servant who was headed up the Fish and Wildlife. And his replacement was with a political appointee who was seen as unqualified by Carson, uninformed and hostile, actually, to the mission of the agency. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, of course, was her employer. So, am I suggesting that Carson's words have relevancy to us today for the particular political moment we find ourselves in, and so can offer us some kind of solace in the recognition that other smart, visionary, environmentally minded people, including the patron saint of U.S. environmental consciousness herself, Rachel Carson, have confronted administrations hostile to the goals of what was once called conservation and what we now call sustainability? Am I saying that we've now been returned to the dark, perilous hours of paranoia during McCarthyist America, out of which rose Rachel Carson, and that her message in those days about the right to know, giving us the obligation to endure, is important to us today and can offer us some kind of, is a kind of a fireplace that we might want to gather around to find comfort? Actually, I'm not. I'm not here to console you about anything. And were I to use Rachel Carson's own words to make us feel less distraught and less horrified at the emergency we find ourselves in, and the perilous state of our nation's own democratic institutions, and the faltering state of the world's ecological systems, I would be administering to you, to use Rachel's own words herself, little tranquilizing pills of half-truth. At a time when the very democratic pillars of our republic are being pulled down around us, and I'm not going to do that. So let's not try to soothe ourselves. Let's not try to say that Carson got through this and so will we. And let's begin by articulating the historic differences between then and now, the cultural moment when Carson was writing. How is it different from now? And the most obvious one is this. President-elect Eisenhower was the former commando of NATO. And yes, he oversaw and contributed to the frenzy of Red Scare, the fear of infiltration by communists that led to the arms race and an existential danger. But Donald Trump is a mentally unstable, tax-evading, proudly ignorant sexual predator who has unbounded ego and is without any evident sense of self-sacrifice or self-discipline. He has no experience in public service of any kind, and he reveres the authoritarian rule of Russia. He has elevated neo-Nazis and white supremacists and homophobes and xenophobes and misogynists to exalted posts within our federal agencies of our own nation. So we're not talking about firing individual public servants and replacing them with political hacks. We're talking about bringing down the very agencies themselves, transforming them into their opposite, including the Environmental Protection Agency, which Carson worked so hard to imagine and to make happen. Democratic institutions themselves can be systematically and irreparably damaged. They are like the breaking apart of the Arctic sea ice. We can reach tipping points beyond which this republic is no longer repairable, and that is where we find ourselves, friends. So Carson's very quote, that public-minded citizens feel this way, reflected a point of patriotism in 1952 and a point of pride. The national parks, the national highways, our national resources. But that's not true anymore. We are living in a time now where the idea of public is suspect. Public health, public schools, public science, public scholarship, these things are no longer points of pride. And we just have to be honest about that, really, really honest now. The role of writing is the second thing I want to mention as a point of difference. The role of the public critic has been devalued. Carson, as an author, when she wrote her letter to the editor of the Washington Post, it was picked up by the Associated Press for syndication. It was also appeared in the Reader's Digest. The whole nation read Carson's letter because she was an exalted figure as a writer, even as young as she was in 1952. When she wrote her book Silent Spring years later, as a direct response to the takeover of Fish and Wildlife by political hacks, she decided the thing to do was to leave and write a book, to bring science out of this obscurity of the peer-reviewed literature and before the nation. That was her response to her situation. She could do that because her book would be syndicated in the New Yorker. It would rocket to the top of the bestseller list for more than a year, and the whole nation would come to terms with it. There's no author that holds that kind of position in our culture today. There's nobody like that. And then third, it has to do with the difference. The third difference I want to highlight here is the role of science. Carson's challenge as a woman was to be seen as a credible messenger of science, and her critics in industry wanted her to be seen as something not scientific. They called her hysterical. They referred to her emotional feelings about the mystical balance of nature. Most famously, the Secretary of Agriculture called her a spinster and pointed out she had no business speaking about future generations because she had no children of her own. Walter White Stevens wore black glasses and a white lab coat when he appeared on TV to excoriate her in an interview, which was shot in what vaguely looked like a laboratory. White Stevens accused Miss Carson of, quote, gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field. In fact, White Stevens was not a scientist. He was a representative of the pesticide company Velsicol. And Carson's message, as expressed then, as she pushed back against this, in a speech to the Boston Garden Club, asked who speaks for science and why, that we need to ask this question, pointing out that chemical companies were now wrapping themselves in the language of science, which held an exalted position in our culture of the day. It was the height of Sputnik. Baby formula was called formula to sound like science. It was said to be better than breast milk. And so what she wanted to point out is that when chemical companies become corporate members of scientific society and speak for science, that these represent conflicts of interest. And when she revealed these things, they were scandals at the time. Those are no longer scandals. In my world of biology, those now are called public-private partnerships, and that's just business as usual. When she pointed out that pests evolve resistance to pesticides and that eventually they would not become effective, she did so by arguing, and again, I'm quoting her from a speech, it would be hard to find any person of education who would deny the facts of evolution. That was true then. So we have an administration now that doesn't need to argue about science because science doesn't matter. And facts don't matter. So that on the very same day that our president-elect could dismiss climate change as bunk, which is only a couple of days ago, the state of Tennessee caught fire and turned into an inferno, quote, unlike anything anyone has ever seen in recent history, according to somebody who lived through it. On that very same day that the president-elect referred to the facts of climate science as bunk, the Arctic ice began to reach 27 degrees higher than normal, which compelled our climate scientists to issue an SOS that something has happened now. We have reached some kind of trigger, some tipping point. This is not just the normal linear pattern that we've been seeing, but something really new and unprecedented and terrifying is happening. So NASA is to be defunded of its climate science. We're going to try to exit a hard-won international treaty that is science-based that was 21 years in the making. I was very proud to be in Paris last year at COP21 to both contribute to the dialogue by giving a presentation and witness the success of those meetings. The World Health Organization clearly indicates that climate change is the biggest threat to the health of children born today. The military leaders of our own nation has identified climate change as a leading threat to our own national security, but these facts are disputed and called and discarded as bunk. This is something new. That's what I want to say. This is nothing like what Rachel Carson faced in her time. We're no longer arguing about what the facts are. We're simply discounting fact-based decision-making altogether. We're denying the existence of facts. And scientists who speak out publicly about facts and even publicly about the results of their own data are now being called biased, as though objectivity in science were somehow the same as political neutrality. There are scientists who have really important data that I have met with who won't even go before any public fora or the media or elected representatives to speak publicly about their science because advocating for your own data is now called biased. So, fourth difference I want to point out, we are simply out of time. At the end of Carson's life, she was able to console herself by watching monarch butterflies. She said that unhurried westward drift of one small winged timeless, that unhurried westward drift of one small winged being that is pulled and drawn by some invisible force. That the fact that she was witnessing these in the last few months of her life, that she knew this was the last time she would see the southern migration of the monarchs, but she knew that their migration would go on and on, that it was a timeless thing. That's no longer true. The monarch butterflies are heading for extinction, along with 1 out of every 4 mammals, 1 out of every 3 sea mammals, and half of all the birds. They're all going. She said she felt, and she wrote to her dearest beloved Dorothy, she said she was feeling that the river always flows to the sea, and that would always be there, and that this was the kind of sacredness and divinity to her that she could hold on to, knowing that these things would go on without her, and she had spent her life in a sense of wonder about them. That is also no longer the case. The seas are rising and filling the rivers with salt water. It's done. It's not there for us at the end of our lives. Last year in Paris, the best climate scientists in the world agreed we had about 2 decades to rapidly decarbonize. This year in Marrakesh at COP22, it turns out that the worst case scenarios were not even worse enough, and it looks like maybe we have 5 years. So when I received an invitation yesterday from the Library of America to serve as an editor of a 2-volume edition of the works of Rachel Carson, a task that would involve preparing notes, selecting contents, creating a chronology of Carson's life, doing media appearances and public events, my first thought was, what an incredible honor after working in the vineyards that Carson planted for my whole life. Carson is my guiding spirit. I hope I'm worthy of this task. My second thought was, I have no time for this. Not because I'm a busy academic that has 2 children, but because a madman has just been elected president by a minority of Americans in a time of climate emergency, because today's headlines in Scientific American reads, quote, "The Antarctic ice shelf is breaking from the inside out, and where only the most rapid decarbonization will save us." We have to somehow parlay the success that we learned and all the lessons we learned in banning fracking in New York State to the entire nation. And now it's like being asked to play a Chopin recital while the bombs are falling. And you love Chopin more than anything else, but the bombs are falling. That's the dilemma that I feel right now. So what I'm suggesting is that Carson left her day job to write a book to awaken the world about an environmental catastrophe, that is no longer an option for us. Even that is a legacy, is a luxury that we can't afford, because no one cares about books anymore. All of our knowledge are fragmented, and no one cares about facts anymore. And public-mindedness does not exist as a tenet of government, so there's no one in government to appeal to. And finally, simply because we're out of time. So we are, in fact, in uncharted waters. We're not going backwards to the Eisenhower administration. We've crossed the Rubicon to some completely uncharted territory. We have unprecedented politics in front of us, and they can never be normalized. And we have an unprecedented ecological collapse. And so thus the tactics that we must deploy are also going to have to be unprecedented. Developing a sense of wonder, writing books that are full of facts that can be used to give Senate testimony, that the President of the United States will read, that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency will be founded because of, and a whole nation kind of awakens to. Those tactics aren't available to us anymore. So we must invent the tools of our own survival, and they're going to look different than what happened with Rachel Carson. In other words, I'm suggesting we haven't gone back. We've gone forward into some new place. So what legacy then does Carson provide us? Is there anything we can take with her into this new uncharted landscape that we find ourselves? And there are some things, I think. And one is Carson's focus both in Silent Spring, but then in the years after that, as she began to develop the book that she was never allowed to write because breast cancer silenced her and made her lay her pen down. And that was the book, the big book, she called it, about man against nature, in which she was really going to explore the hubris of the human race and the arrogance that leads us to a kind of domination mindset over nature. So she was experimenting with this, both, and you can see it in the early stages in Silent Spring, and then in some of her final speeches, where she talked, and I'm quoting now again, "The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology, and the convenience of man." She referred to pesticides as a crude a weapon as the Caveman's Club. And then near the end of her life, when she appeared in the CBS reports as part of a television program, she said this: "We still talk in terms of conquest. We haven't become mature enough to think of ourselves as only a tiny part of the vast and incredible universe. Man's attitude toward nature today is critically important because we now have acquired a fateful power to alter the destiny of nature." And she was, of course, referring to the nuclear threat as well as to the chemical weapons known as pesticides. So that encouragement toward humility and the recognition that the conquering mindset would actually turn around and destroy us is a message I think we need now more than ever. Consider, for example, what happened here in Washington, D.C. last week at the meeting of the National Policy Institute, which some call the alt-right, which others would call white supremacists. By their own mission statement, they are dedicated to the heritage, identity, and future of people of European descent in the United States. And as the audience members chanted, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," this is what Richard Spencer, the speaker of the day on November 19th, had to say. He said, "America was, until this past generation, a white country designed for ourselves and our posterity. It is our creation. It is our inheritance. It belongs to us. For us, it is conquer or die." And he referred to non-white people as people who had no souls. He said, "I don't even know if we can call them people." And he said to be white is to be a striver, a crusader, an explorer, a conqueror. And for that, he received this and all kinds of cheers. And that happened with people cheering Trump in the same breath. So if we want to have a conversation about conquering, it's a conversation that's about nature, and it's about our brothers and sisters who are different colors than we are, who are not heterosexual, who are from other places and other religions. And these are the intersectionalities now that we need to come together in a large movement like we've never seen before in order to deal with the unprecedented problems that we now have for ourselves. So Carson does, I think, offer us this. And then finally, she offered us and encouraged us to think about the environmental crisis that we face as a human rights problem. And she said this: "If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons distributed by either private individuals or by public officials, it is surely because our forefathers, despite their considerable wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem." And in her congressional testimony in June of 1963, she said, "I assert the right of the citizen to be secure in his own home against the intrusions of poisons applied by other persons. I speak not as a lawyer, but as a biologist and as a human being. But I feel strongly that this is, or should be, one of the basic human rights." And then from her very final speech of her life in San Francisco in October 1963, she said, "Underlying all of these problems of introducing contamination into our world is the question of moral responsibility. The threat is infinitely greater to generations unborn, to those who have no voice in the decisions of today, and that fact alone makes our responsibility a heavy one." So you see that human rights approach now in the climate justice movement that is now a global movement. And the words of contamination, of course, are Carson's words as she referred to poisons deliberately introduced into the air, food, and water that eventually found their way trespassed into our bodies and created health risks for us, which we did not, to which we did not consent. That remains a problem. But the more existential problem, the problem that has a ticking time bomb associated with it, is the other one, which is that the same substances that are used to make those poisons, because they're all petrochemicals, the so-called fossil fuels, are not just raw materials for the pesticide industry. They are also lit on fire, and in so doing, they have filled up our atmosphere and remarkably changed its chemistry so that our climate is no longer stable, right? And that's the problem for which we have only a handful of years before we hit irrevocable tipping points, and no matter what we do at that point, we can't turn around that runaway train. So when you see people standing in North Dakota against another pipeline, and now we see the Trump effect in Canada with Justin Trudeau surprising everyone by approving the Spectre pipeline. Now the Canadians are getting active. This is the beginning of a movement of people who are standing up against the changing chemistry of our climate upon which civilization and life depends. So it's in other words, there are two environmental crises. The chemical contamination one, chemical pollution, is the one Rachel Carson wrote. The other tree of crisis, of course, is the climate crisis. But they're like a double tree with the same root, because at the bottom of them, of course, is a ruinous dependency on fossil fuels. And so the human rights argument you hear over and over again among those on the front lines of the climate justice movement, and we're hearing it most loudly right now from the Native American community who are standing at Standing Rock and making arguments based on human rights, based on water, which can also be ruined during the fossil fuel extraction, distribution, and transportation process. So we need Carson to help us understand the intersections between environmental and human rights. And third, I think, is something that Carson actually didn't talk about herself, but it's the way in which activism can actually open the door to science. This is something she referred to only obliquely in the foreword and the introduction to Silent Spring. Of course, she was very concerned that she present herself as an authoritative messenger of science. So she couldn't really talk openly about the way her work was made possible by activists. But I'm really interested in that because I think we need to have a really honest conversation. Often we think that the science has to be done first, and then everybody has to be educated about the science, and only then does the activism begin. But more and more it seems to me that those who go out and begin to do fight with their whole hearts and try to change things capture the attention of the media, they capture the attention of the public, the Supreme Court system, the legal system, and then people begin to ask questions about what's going on, and that actually makes the science possible. So let me read to you what I wrote about that in the book Courage for the Earth, which came out to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring. Carson was influenced by activism and advocacy as the contemporary environmental movement was influenced by the publication of Silent Spring. So there's an evident reciprocity between activism and Silent Spring. It means that the popular portrait of Carson as a lone, impartial, above-the-fray genius requires some revision. Let's take a look at Olga Owens Huckins, the letter writer that Carson credits with providing the raison d'etre for Silent Spring. As painstakingly documented in Linda Lear's biography, Huckins was more than a concerned citizen pleading with Carson to investigate the ecological effects of pesticides. And here I'm referring to the woman that Carson dedicated the book to, saying it was a letter from this woman Huckins in Long Island who was so concerned about birds dropping dead around the bird bath that Carson decided to take up and really look at the science of all this. But Huckins was not just a housewife from Long Island, which is how Carson needed to write about her and present her. Instead, she was a member of a group called the Committee Against Mass Poisoning, which sought through lawsuits and protests to halt aerial spraying of pesticides. Throughout 1957, members of this committee, including Huckins, wrote letters to the editor of many newspapers. These letters did not scientifically document the evidence for harm created by pesticides, but bore witness to dead birds piling up around bird baths, and they were quite polemical. One of them said, and this is by Huckins, stop spraying of poisons everywhere until all the evidence, biological, scientific, immediately, and long run of the evidence of wildlife and human beings is known. So essentially a kind of articulation of the precautionary principle. The Committee Against Mass Poisoning took a human rights approach to environmental harm. In the parlance of today's environmental activists, the introduction of harmful chemicals into food, air, and water violates the right to privacy as well as security of person. It's referred to as toxic trespass. Likewise, Huckins condemned aerial spraying of pesticides as, quote, inhumane, undemocratic, and probably unconstitutional. So they filed a lawsuit, and that was particularly useful to Carson because it wended its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And then there was discovery, which opened up all this data that had been hidden and that industry had, that Carson would not have been able to get access to if the lawsuit hadn't been in process. So it was also a magnet for media attention. Carson was thus able to elicit the interest of the essayist E.B. White. E.B. White, in turn, piqued the interest of the New Yorker editor, who at the time was the famous William Shawn. And when Shawn offered Carson 50,000 words in the New Yorker, she knew she could go to Houghton Mifflin and get a good book deal. So in other words, environmental activism in the 50s opened up a critical space in the publishing industry for environmental writing. And that development, as much as the slow accumulation of scientific knowledge, was the genesis of Silent Spring. I also think that one of the things that Carson gives to us is the idea that plain spoken and beautiful language, in terms of description, still matters. You know, she was able to deploy what she knew as a creative writer in the service of science to reveal the marine biology of our oceans. She wrote that whole trilogy of book by the oceans and wove a spell where now everyone really wanted to know what went on under the surface of the ocean in this world that at the time no one had really seen. And she was able to use language to create a visual picture of the underworld life. And that, I think, we all need to be engaged in that. And the narrative that we need to create now is about climate change. And we need to talk with it to all of the people in our circles in the most urgent ways. You all know the people who are in your lives and what narrative strategies work the best for them. So there is no one story of climate change that we could take out to everyone. This is going to be unique to generations, unique across ethnic and economic lines and faith lines. And so we need to each be authors to create beautiful descriptions of the climate and then begin to talk about those, reading Rachel Carson to see how she did it. So in other words, we all have to become carpenters, and we can look at how she made her, dovetail joints and just mimic her in how she did this. So my story of climate change, where I speak a lot on college campuses, involves describing how carbon dioxide lasts for 100 years. Methane is the other greenhouse gas. It's a much shorter gas. It's much shorter lived. It only lasts a decade. Where do they come from? Well, carbon dioxide is our exhaled breath. So all living things are exhaling, and we breathe carbon dioxide into the air, and it will outlast us. We'll be dead and buried in the ground, but our breath will go on living after us. And methane, of course, comes from the incomplete breakdown of dead things. And so the dead and the living conspire together to put greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, and that is a good thing, because these two gases, of all the gases in the atmosphere, have the ability, when a ray of heat, thermal radiation from the sun, which escapes at night, if it's struck by thermal radiation, these molecules have the ability to vibrate. And so they vibrate all night long and create friction. And it's like a blanket for us that keeps us warm, which is why life on Earth doesn't resemble the Disney movie Frozen. It's why the seas don't freeze up every night, and your blood plasma doesn't turn to ice every night. So thanks to our exhaled breath of all the living things that came before us, and thanks to the incomplete decomposition created by the dead, the dead and the living together have created a blanket. But through our exhuming of the cemeteries in which prehistoric plants and animals live, the crunchy stuff called coal, the gooey stuff from animals called petroleum, and then the other part of the unholy trinity, the Holy Ghost, natural gas, methane, that those things have entered our atmosphere and have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, so that blanket has gotten thicker and thicker, and we can't kick it off anymore at night. And as it traps heat, the carbon dioxide itself is absorbed into the oceans and is acidifying them. And we're on track now for calcium carbonate to dissolve and go into solution. So everything with a shell is on the path to extinction. And the babies of the things with shells are what we call zooplankton, which are the basis of the entire human food chain, the entire oceanic food chain, upon which 1/6 of the world population depends. So that's my part of the story, and I go on from there because I'm an ecologist, and that's how I tell the story. So you each need to come up with your own story. It can't have graphs and charts in it because no one can talk and think in an interactive way while looking at graphs and charts. I spend a lot of time with data. That's a very private thing. You need a narrative. You need a narrative that you can have a conversation about, and we need to have these conversations. We each have to become apostles and evangelists about what's happening, about the emergency that we find ourselves in. We have to break the silence. Carson knew that about pesticides. That's the lesson we need to take from her to us as we go out and create our own, become our own author on what's happening to us. What Carson didn't do is something else I think we need. She never talked about herself in the first person. She did not engage in autobiography. She took herself out of the frame of the picture. She only relied on scientific description in her writing. She had an incredible amount of courage to do that. To her, the facts were going to speak for themselves. She didn't need to be in the story. She was furious at those in government who held data but wouldn't release it. And wouldn't share their data with her while she was writing Silent Spring. To her beloved Dorothy, she wrote, she thought she was quoting Abraham Lincoln. It's not a quote from Lincoln as I tried to vet it. So she was wrong about that, but it's a great quote anyway. She said, "To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards out of men." To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards out of men. That's what drove Rachel Carson to believe that we all have the obligation to break silence around things that are homicidal abominations, and that is what she did with facts. I think what we need to do now in a world where facts don't seem to matter is bring the autobiography back in and tell the story in a first-person way, the way the Native Americans are doing now as they stand as standing rocks in their own community, to talk about themselves in this place, what the water means for them, what the treaty means for them, what their children need, and that they are standing here for these particular reasons. And those of you who know my own work know that I made a different decision than Carson to reveal my cancer diagnosis and talk about myself together with the data. I'm happy to say that no one's impeached my science based on my memoir. So I think there is some progress there. And in a world where facts don't matter, to stand up and say, those children of future generations that are going to be harmed by climate change, those are the kids across the dinner table from me every night. And it's my job as a mother to protect my children from harm and plan for their future, and fossil fuels is making it impossible for me to do my job. You're coming after my kids, President-elect Donald Trump, and I'm going to resist you every step of the way because I'm a mother and I'm a biologist and I have knowledge, and this is what we're going to do now. So bringing yourself back into the picture, something Carson didn't do, but I think it's a tactic available to us. Finally, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas weighed in on Silent Spring. He said, "We need a Bill of Rights against 20th century poisoners of the human race." The Supreme Court is not going to say that to us. We're on our own. So we're going to have to invent a great narrative that has the power to move people and create some kind of unprecedented uprising that is, whose magnitude matches the moment that we find ourselves in. And I think Carson is by our side as we do this. So I'm going to end there by introducing the other special person I want to recognize in the audience. This is Colleen Boland, who is headed out to Standing Rock, North Dakota, in a couple days. Colleen, could you stand up so the cameras can pan on you? Colleen Boland has long experience here in Washington. She's retired from the Air Force as a senior master sergeant. She worked in the White House space program under the first Bush administration. She has had more than 20 tours of active duty and has seen in that time when she served her country in the military how contaminated water and environmental problems create security risks and conflict and make people sick all over the world, in places like Syria, in places like the Philippines. Now that she's retired, she and I have worked together in a civil disobedience movement called We Are Seneca Lake, which has attempted to prevent a Houston-based gas company from using salt caverns underneath and beside Seneca Lake to become a gas station for fracked gas, storing the gas in our community before it's put into pipelines and taken to burner tips all across the eastern seaboard. So far, more than 600 people have been arrested. I found myself next to a jail cell with Colleen Boland, which is how we met. We were in jail for 9 days together, and if you want to go to jail with somebody, going to jail with somebody who has long military experience and knows how to keep up morale is not a bad thing. So thank you for that. And now Colleen is deploying out to Standing Rock, where, as you may have heard, 2,000 veterans are expected to arrive in the next couple of days. They are called Veterans Stand for Standing Rock, so if you want to Google that or hashtag it and you can follow them, Veterans Stand for Standing Rock. Again, this is an unprecedented action by our nation's vets who feel that they have an obligation to defend against domestic enemies, not just the foreign ones, and that what's happening to the human rights violations that are happening and the environmental violations that are happening at the hands of the fossil fuel industry in general and to the people of Standing Rock, reservation in particular, are worth defending. So this is a story to follow. You've probably seen that the people there have been hit with water cannons and below freezing temperatures. One woman got her arm blown off by a concussion grenade. The most recent news from the governor of North Dakota is that supply lines, those who are bringing supplies into these folks will be fined. So it's a showdown, and it's the beginning of something I think we're going to see again and again. So it's Rachel Carson plus Martin Luther King Jr. plus Gandhi. These are all people that we need to be carrying on our shoulder right now. So I ask you, we'll talk more this afternoon about what tactics I'm talking about, like what is it we're going to do together now. So I'm saving that for that conversation because I would like to be more interactive. But what we love, we must protect. So as we go out and have a sense of wonder about things, we also appreciate the beauty of it all. It's not enough now in this moment to simply teach our children to do that. That's too long, and we're out of time. We also have to actively protect that which makes us wonder. And I would say going to jail and spending time away where you'll see nothing in nature. You won't even be able to look out the window for more than a week. The heartbreak that you feel at being cut off from the natural world makes you realize a radicalizing transformational experience. And so I'm actually suggesting the opposite of what you heard earlier today, which I also still believe in, but which is to take yourself out of a place of wonder and put yourself in a place that's depleted and ugly, where you have only artificial light on every night, that you can't see the sun or a leaf or an earthworm, and do that for a week. And you'll come out of jail more determined than ever to protect what some call creation, which others would call an ecosystem, upon which all life depends. Thank you very much.
Thank you. think we have time for just a couple, because we did get bogged up in, it's no one's fault, but getting through the food line. But I have the magic microphone. As Ronald Reagan once said, I paid for this microphone. Sorry. So ask, speak, share, against the window and the Capitol. You know,
Really quick, thank you, first of all. I don't really have words, but I'll try to keep it quick. I'm sure everyone would have a question. So to be an evangelist, we need an audience generally. And with the American public now, we just reduced our attention span to, I think it's 8.7 seconds, which is 1 second less than a goldfish. So the difficulty is because of social media and the different channels through which people acquire and process information, we don't have a singular source or a key way to communicate the complex concepts of climate change, or even to translate them well, and we don't have an audience that has enough time to digest what is a complex situation. So I put that out to you just out of curiosity to see how you challenge that, or how you might communicate, aside from being an activist, because that's us speaking to each other, but speaking to the people who, in the red states, speaking to people who are not necessarily going to digest that, where we would hear from it. How do we reach them?
Well, there's not one answer, right? So, and I do a lot of speaking in red state communities, and I come from a deeply conservative area of central Illinois. I think the answer is that you reach people where they are. I mean, that's the number one thing you learn in creative writing, to reach your reader. It's the number one thing an organizer will tell you. So you take whatever the overwhelming concern is of that community, and you speak to that issue. So when I'm in, before the gun and pickup truck crowd, then I can talk about jobs. And fracking jobs are killing jobs, right? They have a on-the-job fatality rate that's 5 times that of other industries, and the injuries include crushing injuries, amputations, things that will disable you. There are more jobs now in renewable energy, and they're good, high-paying jobs, and they don't come with the risk of being blown up. And so one of our own employers, where I live in upstate New York, one of the most rapidly growing companies is a solar company, and 1/4 of all of his workforce are former gas industry guys. So we talk about those things. When I speak before church groups, the faith community understands the story of David and Goliath really well, and they remember who won. So I talk about the slingshot we need to build. We talk about the care for creation and our moral obligation to do that. Churches are actually easy to mobilize because in a lot of rural places, they are the center of where people go. You can speak to a lot of people at the same time. And the idea that this is a really difficult fight tends not to be as daunting to people of faith, I've noticed, as other folks. And we have this amazing tool now, the Pope's encyclical, which you can borrow language right from there. At the gates of Seneca Lake, where this, I mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about it this afternoon, where there's a standoff between a gas company and those who don't want frack gas stored there. There were, I think, 7 civil disobedience actions in a row that involved people of faith reading aloud from the Pope's encyclical while they were blockading. And the word became flesh, right? So the Pope was speaking about our moral obligation to protect creation, and it was being read aloud by people who were actually doing that at the very moment they were reading it. And so this kind of caught on. The people came and they brought lawn chairs just to listen to the reading, those who weren't ready to put their bodies on the line yet, but they witnessed it, and they saw people be handcuffed and wearing clerical collars and being taken away. And then they showed up, some of them later, right? So I think the message, I guess what I'm saying is that the message changes. With nurses and doctors, I'll make a health argument. and there's a whole argument and discussion you can do with artists and musicians about the changing ice and the changing chemistry of the atmosphere, these kind of things that are visual or cinematic. So I think that's why I say you're each involved in many communities. All of our lives are very complicated. We have families, we have, some of us belong to faith communities, we have colleagues and peers, and we know how their mind works. So we can, it's like telling the story of the Holocaust, right? There's not just Anne Frank, there's many, many stories. There are many ways to go about this, and we have to keep telling that story. And the climate change story can be told in many different ways in order to reach many different people.
The number of cities and states have been ahead of the federal government on climate change issues. Do you see advocacy at the state and local level be relatively more important for the next 4 years, since that may be where we get the most action?
Well, there's nothing like national policy, and I spend a lot of time in Washington trying to influence national policy, and have done so since I was part of the President's National Action Plan on Breast Cancer during the Clinton administration. And we must meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Treaty. If the U.S. federal government walks away from that, there's no possibility that individual states acting alone can make up the slack. So we have to act as a nation, for sure. That being said, I certainly am interested in figuring out how to move at the state level and use that as a beginning point for other things. That's why I became one of the founding members of New Yorkers Against Fracking, and our governor, Governor Cuomo, became our target. It was really his decision whether to open New York up to shatter the bedrock of our state in order to do economic development by blasting fossil fuel out of the bedrock, or go another direction. And we created, and I was only one player in this vast opera, right, that was the anti-fracking movement there. But altogether, we used scientific arguments, but also we really mobilized his whole political base against fracking in such a way that he not only banned fracking in our state, and it's an enduring ban, but also saw that he could, his political ambitions could be realized by wearing the mantle of a climate hero. I don't think he would have come to that on his own. But that's how it works, right? And we're happy to have him wear that mantle, and we're very glad that Governor Cuomo did the right thing. And that allows us then to appeal to other governors, like Jerry Brown, who has not done the right thing, because the state of California is using what precious water it has left to frack itself, to shame other governors into saying, look, here's a model. New York wants to become the incubator and the laboratory for green energy, and it's going forward in this progressive way. Really, California? You're still blowing fossils out of the ground and lighting them on fire? And so there's a way that we can go kind of from state to state. And obviously the science that we used, that we compiled to make the argument of the public health risks and the climate risks, that science applies to all the different states. So if it's wrong in New York, it's wrong in other states too. The plan had been, when we thought the election was going to go in another way, because I'm also the science advisor for Americans Against Fracking, is to try to take what we had done in New York State and directly influence federal policy. So obviously we're all still reeling from and trying to find our footing to see where we can get leverage and move. But we can't just make ourselves feel better by saying, okay, we can't make change at the national level now, so we'll just retreat to the local level and we'll work on solar gardens in our communities. We're too far down the road to collapse to do that. We have to have large-scale change really rapidly. And and nobody I know has the answer now to how we're going to do this yet.
I think we should probably end our questions there because you've been wonderful. Thank you so much.
And save the rest
Sa-
of them for this afternoon. 'Cause we're
Sandra
gonna
will
carry
be
on.
back with the final panel. We're all going to talk about tactics and where we head and what we do and what's possible and what isn't. So I now want to thank Sandra again. It's just, can I say? Yeah.